Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez audio and video podcast series. All right, today we're cracking open a set of source documents that lay out a really unique and detailed framework for looking at the history of modern China. So let's just dive right in. So let's just jump right to the heart of it, the central claim. The entire thesis of the material we're looking at is summed up in this one quote. The core argument being made is that the rise of communism in China wasn't some kind of organic, homegrown movement, but was actually a fully managed project. Okay, so let's unpack that foundational argument a little bit. The source material is essentially proposing that specific Jewish individuals and organizations were the masterminds behind communist rule in China. Now, to understand how the source even begins to build that case, we have to look at a pretty important concept it introduces right at the start. And this idea right here is absolutely crucial to the entire narrative presented in these documents. The source uses the term crypto-Judaism to describe what it calls a strategy of assimilation, but for the purpose of infiltration. The idea is that a population could look, act, and seem completely Chinese on the outside, while secretly holding on to a different identity and agenda. You could say this idea of a hidden, influential group is basically the bedrock for all the other historical claims that follow. Now, to build this case, the source material doesn't start in the 20th century. No, it goes way, way back. Over 1,000 years, in fact. The narrative really zeroes in on the Kaifeng Jewish community, claiming they became incredibly powerful, even enjoying what's described as a golden age. According to this view, this long history of fitting in, of assimilating, was the perfect cover for building a deep-seated base of influence. All right, let's switch gears and look at the actual timeline. The source documents lay out a very specific chronological path to try and connect this ancient history with the huge events of the 20th century. So the timeline kicks off deep, and I mean deep, in the past, claiming Jewish traders were a dominant force on the Silk Route as early as 200 BC. From there, it follows the establishment of that Kaifeng community, their high point during the Ming Dynasty, and the power of figures like Zhao Yingjiang, who was a top government official that helped rebuild the community's synagogue. This is all laid out as proof of a powerful and well-established presence, long before the modern era even began. And by the mid-1800s, this wasn't a small community, according to the source. It cites this very specific estimate from 1864, made by an officer in the British Navy, who believed the Chinese Jewish population had swelled to 1 million people. This number is used to really drive home the potential scale of that crypto-Jewish population that the narrative claims was growing in the background. And this is where the timeline just hits the accelerator. The narrative points to the arrival of Jewish traders from the diaspora in Shanghai, followed pretty quickly by the creation of Masonic lodges where Jewish members were supposedly rising to the top ranks. Then, bam, you get the 1911 revolution, led by a man the source identifies as a Freemason, Sun Yat-sen. After that, Bolshevik agents start showing up from the Soviet Union, guys like Vatinsky and Borden, who are presented as the key architects of what would become the Chinese Communist Party. And finally, the Second Sino-Japanese War is framed as the crucial second step in this master plan. So the timeline hits 1949, the People's Republic of China is established, and you might think the story ends there. But according to these documents, not even close. The source claims this influence just continued, pointing to things like the 5 Jewish members on the team that translated Mao's works, the powerful Kadoorie family being welcomed back to invest under Deng Xiaoping, and a Mossad official named Shaul Eisenberg kicking off defense tech trade. This alleged influence, it says, stretches all the way to today. Okay, so we've got the timeline. Now, who are the main players in this story? The documents give us a real who's who, profiling the central figures, Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and of course, Mao Zedong, along with their supposed networks. First up, we have Sun Yat-sen, the guy who led the revolution that ended thousands of years of imperial rule. But in this telling of history, he's not exactly the independent nationalist hero you might read about in textbooks. He's portrayed more as the first major piece on the chessboard. So, how was he supposedly controlled? While the source points to a few key levers of influence, his connection to Freemasonry is said to have plugged him into their network. His marriage into the powerful Song family, which the source identifies as Jewish, is framed as a strategic alliance. He was also surrounded by advisors the source calls handlers, like Mikhail Borden. And finally, his financial backing and his vocal support for Zionism are all presented as more proof of his role in this larger plan. All right, let's move to the next key figure, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the nationalists who took over after Sun Yat-sen, And, you guessed it, he's also depicted as being deeply tangled up in this same web of influence. And you see a really similar pattern here, almost like a playbook. Chang also married a sister from that same Song family, and his government was apparently financed by Sir Victor Sassoon. The source also highlights his close personal ties, like being a sworn brother to a man it identifies as a Chinese crypto-Jew. And this pattern of influence, the narrative claims, even extended down to the next generation, with his son also marrying a Jewess. And that, of course, brings us to the final and most critical figure in this entire story, Mao Zedong. In this narrative, he's not just another player. He is the endgame. The absolute cornerstone of the source's claim about Mao is right here. It pulls a quote from a paper that allegedly described him as a great son of the Kaifeng community, which directly links him back to that ancient Jewish presence we talked about at the very beginning. This claim of heritage is really the linchpin of the whole argument about his role. So, building on that bombshell claim of heritage, the narrative then lays out how Mao was supposedly put in power and kept there. It claims he was installed through the Skull and Bones Society's Yale in China program. Once he was in power, his government is described as being pro-Jewish, with Jews in key positions. They point to specifics, like the 5 Jewish foreigners on his official translation team. On top of that, his Soviet mentors and even other top communist leaders like Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai are also alleged to be Jewish. So Mao is shown as the final piece of the puzzle, an agent put into power and completely surrounded and supported by this massive network. So we've seen the timeline, we've met the characters, but the source material goes one step further. It actually organizes this whole narrative into a strategic framework, presenting it all as a planned geopolitical operation. It's laid out as this big, two-phase project. Think of it like this. The goal for Old China was the quiet part, the slow, patient infiltration over centuries. Then the goal for New China was the loud part, the execution phase, using chaos and controlled leaders to build a communist state, which the source claims is ultimately run by a Masonic elite. And here's that strategy broken down into 3 clear operational phases. Phase 1, from way back in 750 up to the 1800s, was all about setting the foundation. Phase 2, from the 1800s to 1930, was about consolidating power, bringing in international money, and creating networks like Masonic lodges. And finally, Phase 3 was the execution, using that 2-step process of leveraging 2 wars to get the job done. This table really ties it all together, right? It's like a cheat sheet for the whole plan as the source presents it. Sun Yat-sen's job was to break the old system, and he was controlled through Freemasonry and handlers. Chiang Kai-shek's job was to run a temporary fake republic controlled through his wife and money. And Mao's job was to bring it all home and install the final communist state, controlled through his alleged heritage and handlers linked to groups like Skull and Bones. Each one is portrayed as a managed asset with a very specific purpose. Finally, let's focus on the core mechanism that the sources claim was used to make all of this happen. It's a method the documents call the 2-step process. The whole narrative really hinges on the strategic use of 2 major wars. The First Sino-Japanese War is presented as the catalyst, the thing that shook the stable Qing dynasty so hard it made the 1911 revolution possible. Then, decades later, the Second Sino-Japanese War was supposedly used to finish the job, to destroy the republic that had been created, clearing the path for the CCP to take over, which the narrative says was helped along by economic sabotage. So, the source material we've gone through presents a complete, if alternative, history of modern China, and the final question it really leaves you with is this. Does the framework it proposes change the way we should understand the conventional story of 20th century Chinese history? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez audio and video podcast series produced and archived at the website dailybriefs.info.